Hello, welcome to the Maya Toolbelt. This is Michael. Today we're going to go into the Hypershade to talk about the Sampler Info Utility Node. Now, so we're going to be doing a lot of Hypershade work, and in case you didn't know, the Hypershade is Maya's material editor. So in order to work with the Hypershade, we have to open it, of course. And there's several ways to open the Hypershade. If you click this little blue button, it looks kind of like a pool ball. But click it, it will open the Hypershade window like this, and it's a floating window that's over my UI. Now, one thing I don't like about this is if I ever want to look at my scene, I have to kind of pull this down, work in my scene, then kind of pull this back up. So one thing I do like to do, let me close this, is to make the actual panel I'm looking at the actual Hypershade. To do that, you can go to Panels, Panel, and then choose the Hypershade panel. It will convert my perspective camera into the Hypershade itself. So instead of having a floating window, this will actually be my UI. The channel box is over here on the right side. I can click this tab to collapse it. So one thing you also can do, you can put a viewport window in your Hypershade to still view your scene. To do that, you'll go to the window menu and click on viewport. Now, my particular version of Maya seems to not like to do that. So yours might work fine. And that's okay. So I'm going to hit the space bar to go back to my perspective camera, and I'm going to open the Hypershade again as a floating window. And then with the floating window version of Hypershade, I can go to Window, Viewport, and now my viewport works. I'll dock it into the UI like this and pull this over like that, and now I can close the Hypershade again and then go back to Panels, Panel, Hypershade. And now my viewport is there in the Hypershade. I have had it work before, so yours might have worked fine. You can just dock the viewport into the UI like I just did. But if it's not working for some reason, you might have to close the Hypershade as a panel, open it as a floating window, dock the viewport, and then reopen the Hypershade as a panel if you wish to do so. Using the floating version of the Hypershade works just fine. I just like to have this nice clean view of my UI. So anyway, today's video we're going to be talking about the Sampler Info Utility Node. So over here in the Create area, let's click on Utilities and look for Sampler Info. We can type in this little box SAMP, and you can see it kind of filters the lists. And here we have Particle Sampler as well as Sampler Info. I'm going to click on Sampler Info once to create one, and I can delete this text to get rid of that filter. And I can zoom in here and see what we have. So the Sampler Info Utility node is a very unique utility. It has a lot of different components, all doing very different things. The kind of thing that is in common about all of them, for the most part, is that it's all based on information being sampled from the camera. So my perspective camera, for instance. And I will be completely honest, and the vast majority of these I don't really use in my day-to-day work. Okay, probably the most commonly used attribute of the Sampler Info Utility node is the facing ratio attribute. And if you do a YouTube search on the Sampler Info Utility node, you'll find 9 times out of 10 that's the video you'll get, is how to use the facing ratio aspect of the Sampler Info node. And that's what we're going to do today also. We will talk about that. We also have the flipped normal attribute. That's a very useful one, and I'll talk about that as well. Now, the vast majority of these other ones, I personally have never really used. Okay, that's not to say that they're not useful. It's just as a artist in the game industry where I come from, you kind of do modeling and texturing and so on. You don't really mess with this stuff. And what I'm going to do, this is going to be part 1 of our Sampler Info Utility node video. Because what I like to do, I don't want to just tell you about these attributes of the Sampler Info and what they do, but I'd also like to show you some kind of practical use for them. And if I don't know a practical use for it, I'd rather not show it to you yet, okay? If you want to really see what all these different elements do, I do suggest looking in the Maya help files. They will kind of explain what each one does in kind of a broad sense. But as for a very useful way to use that, I need to kind of do some research and play with it a little bit and kind of find out, okay, how is this useful? What can I actually do? And show you guys like how you would use this, like practically. So bear with me as I do more research on the sampler info node, just because I haven't really used them. I mean, someone else may have used these things all the time in their field, but me personally, I haven't. So the first one we can look at is facing ratio. Now, yes, this was going to be very similar to the other facing ratio content on YouTube. Can't really help that so much, but that's just what it is. But before we get into that, I do want to demonstrate one real quick thing about the sampler info node that is a little bit unique, I think. If you look at it now, we have our three empty ovals, shapes right here in the upper right corner of the sampler info utility node. This is showing us that this right here that we're looking at, this is the default detail level of this node. And it's showing us all of the inputs of these different attributes. So we can have different elements feed into these attributes of the sampler info node. If I click it once, you can see that top oval fills in and it collapses all the information. This is our lowest level detail, where we don't have any real detail at all. It's just a icon, just so we can, if we have a very cluttered scene, we can click this button here to kind of clean up our elements, clean up all the nodes in our work view so they're not taking up so much space. If I click it one more time, we get this kind of bare minimum information, this kind of box here we can type in with a message. Not too useful, but if I click it a third time, this gives us full detail, quote unquote, of the sampler info node. Now it's actually this pretty much the same information as we saw before, but now we're looking at the outputs. So these are the outputs from the sampler info node. If I click it that fourth time, it goes back to the default, and these are inputs. You see the little arrow on this line I'm dragging out is pointing into the sampler info utility. If I click it again a couple times to go back to this view, these are arrows pointing out, outputs from the sampler info node. So the first default view here is these are all inputs waiting to accept information from other nodes. Okay. Now if you want these to actually output information, you have to click this a few times to get to these outputs that you can then drag to other elements in the Hypershade. So it's a little bit unique in that sense. Most of the nodes, as far as I've seen, don't really work that way. They usually show both, for the most part. But here we have our inputs at our default view. Click it a few times, then you get your outputs. Okay, so kind of a unique way of working with this node. So with the facing ratio attribute, it looks at the normal of the object based on how the camera is looking at it. So if I create a sphere, you can see it in my viewport here. Press the 5 key and we can get rid of the grid and zoom in like this. All right, so facing ratio. So the facing ratio, so it's facing us. If you're familiar with surface normals, okay, then the definition of that essentially is the surface direction. All these facets, all these faces of the sphere have an invisible line kind of pointing perpendicularly out from those faces. And we can actually display the normals. Let's go to, with the sphere selected, let's go to display polygons, and looks like a face normals. I click this, you can see the face normals actually get displayed in the scene. So these are all the normals or the surface directions of all these different faces. Okay. So facing ratio. So we're looking at the normals that are facing us, right dead center of the sphere. That little green line is pointing straight at the camera so much you can't even see the line. It's just pointing straight at us. You can barely see it right there. And as the surface of the sphere curves away from us, those normals are starting to point more and more out in these oblique, these other directions away from our facing angle. Okay. And so the normals on the outer edge of the sphere, for example, are all pointing essentially perpendicular to our view. So the facing ratio looks at our object, whatever this is applied to, looks at our object and says, okay, these faces over here are facing away from us, and these faces in here are facing toward us, and we're going to do something different based on that information. And that can be fed to different things in a lot of different ways. The most common way that I've seen the facing ratio demonstrated is through materials. So you can get a different effect on the outer rim of the object relative to the inner surface of the object. So the most common way to demonstrate this is through materials and showing the effect visually with a material on the object. But you can use it for other things. It's just this is much more common, and I use probably the facing ratio aspect of the sampler info node much more than all the others, for sure. Let's hide our normals now that we kind of understand how that works. Let's go to display, polygons, face normals again to hide them. Okay, so how do we plug this into a material? Well, first, let's create a new material for our sphere. So I'm going to create, let's go to surface nodes for Maya, and we can use like a blend, for example. So here's our blend material. I'm just going to middle mouse click and drag it up here onto the sphere. So you can see that highlight up here, indicating that it has been applied. We'll move the sampler info over here, and let's create a texture. Now, the most common way of demonstrating this is through a ramp, and the reason why ramp is so popular to use for this is because, for one thing, it's just really obvious how it works. It really shows it off really well. So let's go ahead and do that too. We're going to go to the 2D textures of the create area here and use a ramp texture right there. And a ramp texture is a color gradient. You see, by default we have a black to white color gradient applied to our ramp. This is very useful for attributes that use black to white as a masking agent. For example, the transparency of the blend. Wherever the transparency is black, the material is opaque, and wherever it is white, for example here, you can see that it is transparent. So that's one really easy way to use this. So let's go ahead and do that. And we can get rid of this placement place 2D texture node. This controls the placement of the ramp on the object, and we're actually going to be using the facing ratio to do that. So because of that, we don't need this anymore. So I can select it and hit delete. Let me look at the ramp again, just kind of show you how the ramp works. We haven't had a video going over ramp textures yet, but they're relatively simple. They may look complex with all the sliders and things down here, but in this, essentially what we have here is a V ramp, or you can choose other kinds of ramps, but V ramp or U ramp are the most common. If I apply the out color here and apply it to the color of the blend, we can see it more apparent what happens. Oh yeah, I need to press the 6 key on my keyboard to turn on texture view so I can see how the texture is applied to the sphere. So here we are. You can see how this black to white gradient is applied to the sphere when I apply it to the color of the object. Again, this is a U ramp. If I choose V ramp, you see what happens here. So the black is down at the bottom pole of the sphere, and it gradients up to the top of the sphere, where it's white here on top. So black on the bottom, white on top, and the U ramp, like we just saw before, goes this way. Left, like starts here at this seam, goes around the sphere, and comes back to the seam again on the other side. So black all around the sphere to white this way. And then of course there's also diagonal ramp and other things like this. And you can see this kind of little picture right here to kind of show you what's going on. If a diagonal ramp is coming in from the bottom corner like this, and radial ramp and so on. But for the most part, U ramp and V ramp are the most commonly used attributes or types of ramps. So with that in mind, let's look over here at the ramp. Now you remember that 2D placement node that was going into the ramp here at UV coordinates. Let me zoom in here. It was being fed here into the UV coordinates to control the placement of the ramp. Okay. Now, one thing to understand about UV coordinates, this is a double float value. Double float value. And the facing ratio is a single or just float value. If you're not sure what I mean by that, I do have a video going over the Hypershade data types that we're working with when dealing with the Hypershade nodes. I do encourage you to look at that video and kind of get an explanation on what a float value is versus a double float versus a vector value. Those are all the kind of data types that we're using here for the most part. So definitely go look at that and then come back here. So the UV coordinates here are a double float value, essentially, which means there's two values here, a U coordinate and a V coordinate, both being fed into the UV coordinate attribute. And facing ratio is a single value. So you see as I float this over here to connect it to the UV coordinates here, for example, it grays out, as well as these other ones, out color and so on. And that's because you can't connect two types of data that are not the same kind of data. This is a float value, this is a double float value. So you can't connect those like that. But what you can do is expand the UV coordinates to expose both values and then plug the facing ratio into one of those. So this is a V ramp, so we can plug the facing ratio here into the V coordinate. And as soon as we do that, you can kind of see what happens here. And if I emphasize this black area of the ramp, you can see how it encroaches in to the center of the sphere from the outer ring. So it's using that facing ratio. And the reason why we're plugging it into the V coordinate is because this is a V ramp. If we did have a U ramp, for example, we would need to delete this arrow and plug it into the U coordinate instead to get this same result. Okay, so that's the only real difference here. It doesn't really matter which one you choose, just if you have a U ramp or a V ramp, you have to plug the facing ratio into the corresponding U or V coordinate of the ramp to get this to work. So the out color of the ramp for now is being plugged into the color of the blend so we can see it here. Now this is very useful for lots of different applications. For example, if you consider like a toon shader, have these dark outlines around your geometry all the time, and no matter how I rotate the camera, let me turn on the wireframe view, no matter how I rotate the camera, that dark outline, because of the ramp, how it's constructed here, is always on the outside of the sphere because of facing ratio. As the sphere rotates, the facing ratio is seeing how the normals are moving and changes this ramp color display, again based on our camera view on those, and make sure that this side of the ramp, the black side, is always on the oblique angles away from our view. So no matter how I rotate this, that black outline is always on the outside of the sphere. So different ways of using this. This is obviously one way. Applying this ramp into the color of the blend, you can get this outline effect. Let me cut this arrow off. Go back to object mode. If we plug this out color into, for example, transparency down here. So now we plugged it into the transparency of the sphere. You can kind of see, if I deselect it here very easily, the outer rim of the sphere is opaque and it's bleeding into the center of the sphere where it is transparent. Because I have a very sharp edge here in my ramp, we can change this and get a much more gradual effect like this. So as I rotate the sphere around, no matter where I'm looking, the center of the sphere is always this transparent effect. And this could be a very cool effect for example, bubbles, like different glass materials, things like that. You can get that Fresnel effect. Fresnel being that reflection that you see on the outer edge of glass and water and things of that nature. If I change this black color to more of a dark gray, so the outer rim does still have some transparency, but you can still see it. So we have white color on this side, and we have a more of a grayish color on this side. We can get this kind of bubble effect. So some very interesting things you can do with this effect. So let's plug it into the color, let's plug it into the transparency. You can plug it into reflections, again, to get more reflections on the outer rim, again, that Fresnel effect. This is a very practical use of facing ratio, mostly used with ramps, but you can, of course, use other things, and plugging those at the out color of the ramp into different elements of your material. So very cool. Okay, let me show you another practical application of using the sampler info node. Up here in my browser, if I click on utilities here, you can see that my sampler info from before is still there. And if I click it, middle mouse click and drag it over here, I can drag it into our current work view. Instead of making a new sampler info node, we can simply use the same one. It doesn't really matter. Now you'll notice when I have done that, I'm still getting all my inputs over here on the left side, but I do have this circle for an output right here. And that's because this is currently being used by our material we made just a minute ago. So when you see this little green circle right here, you can know that this means that this sampler info utility node is currently being used by something that we're not seeing here in our work area. That's what that means. So, but they can be shared between different elements. You could do that. You don't have to make multiple sampler info nodes every single time. So the one I want to show you today is flipped normal. Flipped normal. And you can see it here in the sampler info node, we have a checkbox for flipped normal. So flipped normal is looking through the camera, looking at our objects, and asking the question, are the normals facing toward the camera or away from the camera? And it kind of says yes or no, and it kind of feeds that into whatever you feed it into. Well, what could that be? So how is that useful? So for example, one thing we could do is use this attribute of the sampler info utility to tell an object to display one texture on the front side of a face, the side of the face where the normals are facing toward us, and a different texture on the back side of a face with the one that has normals facing away from us. So for example, let's create a dollar bill. And if I go to create polygon primitives, I'll just make a plane. You see it right here. I'm just going to kind of give it this rectangular shape that you would associate with money, and then we can scale it up a bit bigger. I'll hide the grid for now. I'm going to open up my channel box over here. I'm going to change my subdivisions. So let's take the subdivisions width down. We don't need that many horizontal divisions, but if I'm going to kind of fold this money over so you can kind of see the front and the back at the same time, I need some subdivisions in the height. So I'm going to increase this up to say about 20. And then I'll just go to deform, non-linear, and bend. I'm just going to bend this money. So this is the bend deformer. We do have a video going over this if you're curious. I'm not really going to talk about it too much right now though. I'm just going to use it for the sake of bending my money. Right now it's bending in the wrong direction. So with this, I'll delete the history now to get rid of our bend deformer, and now I have this plane that's kind of curling up so we can see both the front side and the back side. And the way we know which way is front or back, we can go to shading and have this option called back face culling. So what that means is wherever there's a face facing away from the camera, it'll cull it out, which means it becomes invisible. You can see here, if I click this, you can see the wireframe of these faces, but because these faces normals or surface directions are facing away from the camera, they're turning invisible, they're culling out. So we know that these faces are facing away from us, the surface directions are facing away from the camera. So go back to shading and turn back face culling off so I can see it. We can go forward with this. So I'm going to make a material. I'm going to use a condition node, a condition utility node, and we have talked about the condition already. Feel free to click on the little eye in the upper right corner to look at all these videos I'm referring to. We're going to use the condition utility node where the condition is going to say, are the normals of the object facing away from us? If true, we apply a certain texture. If false, we apply a different texture. So let's do that. Let's go create a new material for our money. Go over here to the create area, click on surface and choose a Lambert material. Make more space over here. I'm going to middle mouse click and drag my Lambert 2 onto my object. We can rename this to be money. And I'm currently in the United States, so I'm going to use American money as my textures. I've already got some textures ready. So I need to create two texture nodes. So over here in the create area, I'm going to click on 2D textures and click on a file. I'm using a file because I have some money textures that I found on the internet that I'm going to use. So I'll click on file twice to make two file textures. So here's our two files. So file, let's say file number 1, I'm going to browse to one of my images. So here we have the front face of a American $500 bill, which is no longer in circulation, but the reason why I like it is because the president that you see on here is William McKinley, who's actually a relative of myself. So there's my great whatever uncle or something like that. So William McKinley on here on the $500 bill. for this file 1, and we can call this bill front. On this file, we'll search for the back. So here's what the back of the $500 bill looks like. And yes, the colors are brighter on the back than the front. I'm not sure why. That's how it is. So I'll call this bill back. So we have bill front and bill back. So what we're going to want to have happen is wherever the normals are facing away from us, or I should say wherever the normals are reversed, we'll see the back of the bill, and wherever the normals are positive directions, or the top of the bill here, we'll see the front of the bill. Okay? So first, we're going to need a condition utility node. So we'll go over here under utilities, and we're going to find condition. There it is. So here's our condition. So color if true, which means the normals are facing toward the camera or up, they're not reversed. Color if true, we'll say is the bill front. So out color from bill front is going to go into color if true. Let's rearrange this a little bit. We'll put it down here. And color if false will be the back. Out color to color if false, like this. Okay? So then the out color of the condition should go to the color of the money. So here we can see our money, and I'm going to need to adjust the UV, so let me do that really quickly. If I click on this, I'll go to UV editor, brings up the UV editor here. Just resize this a bit so I can see. And what I need to do is select all these UVs. I need to rotate them. So I can click this little rotate button here to rotate them like this. Let's go this way. I clicked it a few times, and now my bill is oriented correctly in the texture. So I close this UV editor and go back to object mode. So here we go. So now we can see my ancestor's face there clearly, and the back. So you can see on the back, however, it's still the front of the texture, right? We're seeing the front on both sides. So, but the out color of the condition node is going into here, and we have bill front and bill back. So the condition, however, right now is saying equal, and there's first term and second term. So how do we make this work? So this is, I'm going to tell you now, this is not very intuitive. Let me click this a few times to get to our outputs for the sampler info node. Okay, so we can drag out from flipped normal like this. So this is not very intuitive, but here's what you can do. I can click on flip normal and go down here and plug it into this large circle on the upper left corner of condition and let go. And it's going to say, okay, you want to connect the flip normal to this condition. How would you like to do that? Do you want to connect it to the first term or the second term or other? Okay, so let me undo that just so you can see what's going on. So right now we have first term and second term as available inputs, right? So what we're going to do instead though, click on flip normal, go down here to this circle, let go. We're not going to do first term or second term, we're going to do other. And when you click on other, it's going to bring up this list of attributes you can use. And then what we're going to use is operation. Operation is the question that's being asked to get a true or false answer. The question is going to be, are the normals flipped? If I click on operation, you can see, boom, we got this orange arrow coming out from flip normal down to the condition. Now you're not going to see this suddenly change and say flipped normal, but that is essentially what's happening though. The condition now says operation flipped normal. Color if true, we'll get bill front. Color if false, we'll get bill back. Now you'll notice over here though, nothing's changed. Nothing has happened. Now the one drawback, if you want to call it that, is that you will only see this change happen if you render the scene. So let me go to my render view. You click this little film clacker board with the eyeball on it. Make this a little bigger. And instead of using the Arnold render, we're going to just use normal Maya software and click render. So there you can see it. We don't have any lighting in the scene, nothing's going on, but you can see there though that the front of the bill showing the face of the president and so on, and the back of the bill is showing that brighter green of the bill back texture right here, this bright green back, and then there's the normal looking money on the front, right? So you're seeing that bright green over here. I can actually create a light real quick just so we can see that better. Go to create lights. Let's choose an ambient light just to make it pretty obvious. There we go. So there we can see it there. And because I made a light, we have this light node here. If you ever have these nodes that you don't want to see in your working area, if you click on them, you can go up here to Graph menu and say Remove Selected from Graph. It won't delete it, it'll just remove it from your current working area. So you can see with our process worked. We do have two different textures now based on the front-facing faces or the back-facing faces. So the backside texture, however, we're getting this issue where the texture is mirrored. You see, instead of saying the number 500, like the front does, it's like 00 and like this backwards 5. So it's a backwards texture. So we need to fix that issue, right, for this to really be a good tutorial and show you how to do this. See this little S button on these two textures? You can click on these S's to solo those textures. You can see how they're being affected by the UVs of the object. So bill front, if I click on the S, I'm soloing bill front, so I can see the bill front. So you can just look at the back of the texture, you can see that the texture is reversed because we're looking at it from the back, and it's using these UV coordinates showing the front texture from the front, so it looks correct. However, if you do look at it from the back, it's mirrored or reversed. So if I solo bill back, then if we were looking at bill back from the front, the back of the bill from the front like this, it looks fine. However, on the back side, it's still mirrored. It's the same issue. So what we need to do is fix the backside texture to have its UVs flipped. So the front side texture's UVs are fine, like this. That's what we're seeing right here. But the backside texture needs to have its UVs flipped, which is what we're seeing right here. So how do we do that? This is kind of off the topic of this video, but just to show you a very complete tutorial, we're going to go through this and show you how to fix it. So let's go back to the UV editor, UV editor, and select our bill. So here we can see the UVs of our bill, and right now they're oriented in this way, so the $500 bill is on there straight. So what I need to do is make a new UV set. Up here you see I have UV sets. I'm going to say copy UVs to UV set, and I can copy into a new UV set. So I'm making a second set of UVs or texture coordinates that are copying the original. So I'm making a new set like this. Once I've clicked that, you see I have map 1 and map 2, and they look the same. Nothing really changes when I switch between them because I copied the UVs from map 1 onto a new UV set called UV set 2 in this case. So if I click on UV set 2 to make it the active UV set, I'm going to flip these. So select these UVs and we'll go to modify, and we can say flip right here. Now when I click this button, you're not really going to see anything happen because what we've done is the UVs that were on the left side are now on the right, and the UVs that were on the right side are now on the left. So it looks essentially the same, but it has been flipped, okay? Just take my word for it. We selected those UVs, we went to modify, flip, and they were flipped, okay? So, again, UV sets, we have map 1 and UV set 2. Okay, remember that. So I can close this now. So is it working now? If I re-render this, you'll see, nope, it's the same issue. Nothing's really changed yet, but we're going to fix that. And the reason why, again, we see the back side like this, we have the bill back texture being soloed. If I click this little S button, it'll go back to normal. So again, I can re-render this to see our current state. So what we need to do is what's called UV linking, okay? Again, we're going way beyond the original context of this video. So Windows, relationship editors, UV linking, okay? And we have some options here we can choose from. Let's go with texture centric. You can go UV centric or texture centric, either way works, but we'll do texture centric for now. And we have our relationship editor open up. If I click on my bill, we see here on the left side, we show our textures. See a texture category here. We have bill front and bill back. And then we have UV sets on the right. We have map 1 and our new UV set 2. If I click on bill front, you can see it's using map 1. If I click on bill back, it's also using map 1. However, if we click this, now bill back is using UV set 2. Bill front's using map 1. Bill back is using UV set 2. So now, if we pay attention to our number here, we want this to say 500 in a legible way. If I re-render this now, boom, 500. We can read it. Now the backside texture is using the new UV set. The front side texture is using the old UV set, and it all works. So that's how you do it. We've made a piece of money with a single plane. We don't have like a double-sided plane or anything. We just have this setup here. And let's we can minimize that. We can close this. There we go. Get more room over here. So we have our two textures. We have our sampler info node with the flipped normal attribute being plugged into the operation of the condition. And again, it's not very intuitive. You don't see the operation actually change or indicate even that it is being controlled by another node. So that's another practical way you can use a sampler info node. It's a bit more convoluted, a bit more steps involved, especially with the whole UV set thing just for this particular instance, but it will work the same for anything else that you choose to do with this kind of setup. That's all I'm going to really talk about in this video. Again, this is going to be our part 1 of sampler info node. We might not come back to sampler info for a little while because I do actually need to do some research and really look into these other attributes of the sampler info node. Like, for example, matrix eye to world. I have no clue what that's for. I'll have to do, like I said, do some research, get back to you on not just what they do, which I think you can find out on your own with the Maya help files, what these things are all supposedly do, but what I'd like to show you is practical uses. And speaking of which, since I'm doing research to find out practical uses for these, if you happen to know a good practical use for any of these elements of the sampler info node that I haven't talked about, do please, I encourage you to comment in the comments of this video to help me out. If you know, oh yeah, I know how to use point world and use these XYZ coordinates for something useful, feel free to let me know, and I'll include that in a video going over those parts of the sampler info node. But for now, we've talked about facing ratio and flipped normal. I feel like those are really good, useful, probably the most useful, in my opinion, uses for the sampler info utility node. Thanks again for watching, guys, and I'll talk to you later.